Reconvene to public session at 7:05 p.m. And if we could stand, salute the flag, and a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated.
Hoorah!
Okay. Recommend approving tonight's agenda as submitted. First, Mrs. Isler. Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler. Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend the approval of the minutes of the Board of Education regular meeting of November the 15th, 2023.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh. Second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend the approval of the minutes of the Board of Education student disciplinary hearing of November the 15th, 2023.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler. Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Okay, Dr. Larimore, recognition of guest.
Good evening, everybody. Could I have Jay Squirrel Hill come up and join me, please? Yeah. We're getting applause before anything's even said about it. This will be pretty special. I don't think so. Jay Hill has been a bus driver for 50 years for a law school district. 50 years.
Wow.
We had 2016, we had the 30th anniversary of the state championship team, 1986. And everybody showed up, mostly everybody. I'd say probably 95% of people showed up. And I deemed it the last ride with Squirrel. You know, I set it up, the bus parked outside back here, and Squirrel was in there waiting. And Scott Sheridan, Danny Alvarez, and Darren Mills, all these guys, you know, going up these steps to the bus. And they had not seen teammates of theirs for 30 years.
Right.
You know, some of them 25 years. First person they lit up when they saw was Squirrel. There's Jay.
Yeah.
You know, that's the person they wanted to say hi to. You know. And it was just a special time. I remember I was looking out the window, here's Scott Sheridan. He was the last one on the bus, running just like he was Scott Sheridan from 16 years of old, you know. He's the head trainer for the Phillies at the time, you know what I mean? And he's running on the bus to see Jay. And you think about what is there? There's been 7 state championship teams, and you've carried all of them. 5 football and 2 softball. He's carried all of them.
Yeah.
You know, 50 years. You remember that weight room we had built at the other school?
Uh-huh.
There was all the weights that were cut out, you know, they were off weight and everything. And it was a block building. And the summer of 1984 is when we started building it. And I was a freshman. And, you know, Mike Norton, you know, I showed up one day, worked the whole day. They fed us. Showed up, worked the whole day. And the next day, I didn't show up. And Mike Norton, we had summer conditioning, said, "Where were you yesterday?" And I said, "Wait a minute, I did my share. I showed up. I did my share. I showed up for a day." And he told me, like, what would happen if that was everybody's attitude? They showed up, they did their part. You know, I did my part. Somebody else's turn now. 50 years of driving the bus. You think Jay did more than his part?
Yes, indeed.
You think he did his part?
Indeed.
You gotta do more than your part, but some people are not gonna do their part. And that's what Norton told me that day. And when I think about that, I think about you a lot. I really do. Because you have weathered field trips. You've weathered, you know, football games. You did field trips for 30 years, in addition to all this, right? You know, not to mention all the other times when we have, you know, we want to do senior walkthrough, you know, with our seniors going through the elementary schools. You pull up on the bus for that. Free trips. Free trips.
I was gonna say, and even,
Or when we need a ride over to the fire hall for fire prevention week. We pay you for that, don't we? No.
That's okay.
Well, I'm gonna tell you what,
All men are free kids.
Jay Hill has done more than his fair share. He's
Yes.
done more than his part in 50 years, and I hope he's got more to give. But the board and I have a couple gifts for you, and then we're going to get a Polaroid. The first one is a plaque for Distinguished Service Award for 50 years. And the second one, we're going to take out. Here's a customized cutting board. 50 years of service,
Nice,
Jay Hill.
nice.
We got a picture. Susan, Tracy, come on up here. Get up.
I feel like his other family members should come.
Absolutely.
Yes, come on. It's okay. Listen, I'm gonna see this. Come on, let's go. Come on, everybody. Everybody's coming with me. Come, let's go. Yes.
Oh, watch it, there we go. Rosie's coming behind me.
There we go.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. One more, there we go. Make sure you can.
It's got his name on the back door, and then the license plate says Laurel. And then it's got the little kids.
Congratulations. 50 years, that
You want it, Lori, can we get a picture of this bag?
and while they're getting that, I would like to say something. When I first came to Laurel, in the seventh grade, when I came to Laurel, and the first bus driver that I had was Mr. Hill's mother.
Yes.
And let me tell you, you talk about a sweet woman whose the children were, you know, she was more than the bus driver. So I can totally understand, because shortly thereafter, I was in his care through athletics and whatnot. And I can definitely tell, and I tell you, I know she's smiling, because you have,
Mom had 60 years.
you have done not only did he drive, being a person on his bus for all those, from middle school into high school until I left and went back to Indian River, but oftentimes, Mr. Hill wasn't just our bus driver. I mean, he would tell you about this or that, and you get your behavior, or if and it was a sport, and he would tell you like what you need to be doing more of on the court, or what the football this, or you know, you with track, you know. I said, you know, you think if you cut a couple more seconds, it wasn't just a bus driver, and so this is like really, really special to me. I don't know about, you know, I'm sure, but to me, this is really special. And I am so glad that we could give him his flowers while he can enjoy it. I'm just really happy. I am. And you deserve it. I know you keep saying you don't, because you can't find bus drivers like that anymore. Y'all, great job, Mr. Hill. Great job. I remember when I first heard them say squirrel, I said, who in the world is squirrel? It was the boys who mostly would say it. Us girls, he was Mr. Hill. So I said, who? They said, who? I said, who is squirrel? Mr. Hill. Oh, okay.
Who started that Supreme?
Who was it?
Terry Brown.
Oh, gosh. I told you it was a boy.
Remember Terry Brown?
Yes, the wrestler.
Why?
Yes.
Why'd he call him that?
Why did he call you squirrel?
I have no idea.
I heard them kept, they kept some, so who are you talking about?
Okay, thank you. Congratulations, Jeff. Okay, we have no one that signed up this evening, so we're just gonna start right off. Let's see, Mr. Lee, would you like to say anything?
Yes, good evening. So Mr. Hill carried myself and my kids, but I was always afraid that he'd tell my dad if I was bad, so that's why I had to be good. But no, well deserved. I just want to say it's been a very tough year for us. So this is our last school board meeting of the year, right? It's been a very tough year for us in the community, in the school district. But you folks that sitting out here in front of us today are the ones that held it together. So appreciate what you've done all year long, not just, Sean just talked about above and beyond. If you just had to do your job, you just do your job. But you've had to deal with a lot of adversity within the school. And that, it doesn't go unnoticed. So I thank you all for what you have done, and I hope you have a very Merry Christmas if you celebrate. And if you don't, enjoy the time off and time with your friends and family, and enjoy it, because as we've seen this year, life is short. So just take that into consideration, and enjoy the time is what I have to say, and thank you very much for a great 2023 and what you've done to hold this community together. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Pugh?
Yeah, I just want to say Merry Christmas to everybody, and I've said it before, the best teaching and the best learning happens between Christmas and Easter, so get ready. When you get back, it's well ready.
They haven't even had their time off yet.
That's right, it's coming, it's coming.
That was cute. All right. Mrs. Isler?
Just want to, again, as Jana just said, wish everyone a Merry Christmas and pray for a prosperous New Year. And as I always say, please spend time with your families. Mend things that are broken, heal things that are hurt, and continue to nourish things that are growing.
Amen.
There is nothing like family, whether it be your blood, your extended, your friends, and of course, it's being a holiday season, so that gives everybody a little bit extra time, hopefully, to be able to do some of those things. So enjoy your families, just love on each other, and continue everyone that's a part of our district doing the great things that you're doing. They are not going unnoticed. Thank you.
Mr. Nichols?
I think that everybody should realize that, tomorrow is there's no promises for tomorrow. So if you can spend the time with your family, tell the people in your family that you love them, and make sure they know that. And just have a Merry Christmas. Just do what you gotta do. Hope Santa Claus comes see you. Some of you might not make it, but do the best you can with what you got. That's what I've been doing. And Merry Christmas.
The only thing I'm going to say is Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. When we see you, it'll be the Happy New Year. Enjoy the time off, enjoy with family, and as Janice said, next week off will be is it April?
Yeah.
Easter? It'd be April, yeah. Real encouraging, right? Okay, all right. Okay, next we have financial report.
Good evening.
Hello.
Sorry about the date on the cover page. So just some updates from our last meeting. We've submitted the mental health staff report and also the class size waiver. Our Filter First Funds plan was submitted, and we held our Citizens Budget Oversight Committee meeting on December 4th. Things we have coming up. We are still working on a unit count and authorized positions audit with the auditor's office. I'm working on the FY24 final budget. I'll have that to you next month. Our FY '24 reduction plan is due to DOE by the end of the year. And the academic excellence report and also the mental health cash option report is also due to DOE by January 31st. And we still haven't received our enhanced MCI allocation just yet. We are still spending on our FY '23 MCI funds, our regular MCI funds. Once we have that spent down is when we will receive our enhanced MCI allocation. Here's a look at our reserve and local fund as compared to last year. Still continuing on with the trends. And that is all. Any questions for me?
What was the school safety and security?
That's the money that we receive for, to pay the local portion of our constable salaries. And also any other security upgrades like security cameras, things of that nature.
Just got a bracket around, what does that mean? Is this in the anticipated receipts, remaining the bracket, 20,178.
Which page are you on?
120.7%. Yeah, I'm confused. Was that leftover monies or?
No, that means that we received more than what we thought we would.
Oh,
Yeah. So as compared to our budget,
can we do some more on that? I mean, there's some more, there's some others.
that'd be nice.
Yeah, I like that. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Unfinished business, second reading, policy GBAA, staff conduct, harassment, or misconduct towards students. Recommend the second reading of policy GBAA, staff conduct, harassment, or misconduct towards students as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call, not Mrs. Isler, Mrs. Pugh.
I did say it.
Oh, well.
I heard her first. Mrs. Pugh, Mr. Lee,
Approved.
Mrs. Isler,
Approved.
and Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. New business, school choice, we have none. Fundraisers, recommend approval of fundraisers as a group.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
Mr. Lee,
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of fundraisers as submitted.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh,
Approved.
Mr. Lee,
Approved.
Mrs. Isler,
Approved.
and Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Rentals. Recommend to retroactively approve request of Captain Tyler Bryan, Laurel Police Department, for use of Laurel Middle School Media Center and Laurel Stadium track to hold Laurel PD applicant testing held on Saturday, December the 9th, 2023, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., and the certificate of liability insurance was provided.
I recommend approval of use of facility fee and custodial fees waived.
Okay, Mrs. Isler recommends approval of the facility fee and custodial fees waived. That's
Second.
Second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler,
Approved.
Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh, and Mr. Lee.
Approved.
So approved. Professional trips, recommend approval of professional trip as a group.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh, Mrs. Isler,
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of professional trip as submitted.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh, Mr. Lee,
Approved.
Mrs. Isler,
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. We have no items for presentation and review. Possible action on executive session items. A, professional.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols.
Second.
Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
Mr. Lee,
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment B, support. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment B.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler. Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh. And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment C, coaches. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment C.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols. Second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh. And Mr. Lee.
Approved.
So approved. Future agenda items, the next regular board meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, January the 17th, 2024 at 7 p.m. right here at Laurel Middle High School. Do I have a motion? We adjourn.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
So approved. And we adjourn at 7:25 p.m. A little longer this week.